Good afternoon, everyone. So a couple of quick items. I'm Gary Brinkmann. I'm Chief Revenue Officer of Sebright Products. We're a manufacturer of waste and recycling equipment. But what I actually tell people is that we're actually applications-based engineers that happen to build the stuff that we design. So what we focus a lot about in our company is applications specific to each location, but also how do we execute that and how do we meet the regulatory framework based on the place that we're operating within. So today we're going to talk a little bit about packaging waste, circularity, and EPA mandates. But more importantly, how do we create ROI from those? All right, the biggest item that, as we look at right now, packaging waste is not just an environmental issue, it has now become a business risk. Majority of our consumers, I'll throw a few statistics at you guys and not bother you about them too much, but 90% of customers are more likely to buy from brands that have sustainable packaging. 54% of customers are reporting that they're consciously purchasing products with sustainable packaging in the last 6 months. And more than half of millennials, 59%, and Gen Z are purchasing products with sustainable packaging. But more importantly, 43% of customers that were polled are stating that they are willing to pay more for a product with sustainable packaging. And that more than 1/3 of them will actually make buying decisions or switch from their current supplier, right, whatever they're buying, to turn around and make that into something that's sustainable. So this is having real effect. People are making buying decisions. So then why would we care? More states are going to pass EPR legislation. I think we all see the handwriting on the wall. Fact is we have 7 states right now. If you look at it, there's about 15 that are in process right now in various stages. It's not going away. It's being estimated that there's going to be anywhere from 25 to 30 states by the end of 2030, depending on which study that you look at. The variability of legislation is really what's affecting us in the United States. In Europe, obviously, they pass it as the EU, you get a common set of guidelines. Much easier. In the United States, we haven't done it at a federal level. We're doing it at a state level. So consequently, you have 50 different ways to build a light bulb, right? And when you have that variability across the various jurisdictions, you're going to have similarities, but you're also going to have different reporting requirements. You're going to have different specifics to each of those legislative items. So the fact is, it becomes very difficult for brand owners and producers to be able to comply with the law. The financial penalties can be immense. Just in California, you're looking up to potentially $50,000 a day in fines for a producer. That's a big number, right? If you war game that out and not knowing how to comply in California and then having the same business in Maine, your numbers are very easy to trip up and they become, frankly, very expensive. And then we also talk about customer expectations and demands, right, for social responsibility. This is the way that people want to go. I think the evidence is in, the jury's out. People want sustainable packaging. They want you to be sustainable in your practices. 90% of consumers, that's what I was talking about in the very beginning. Fact is that it's the way of the future. And then if you look at future packaging designs, they need to account for this increased regulation. As these states are doing more and more, we have to get ahead of this as a team, right? Whether that's the producers, that's the packaging manufacturers, it's even the people that are doing the recycling on the back end, guys like me. Some of the key concepts, we're talking about regulatory landscape, right? I touched on it in the last slide, but the fact is there's 50 different ways that this is being done, and each of the states are looking to put in their little nugget, and unfortunately that makes compliance a very difficult thing. Even just understanding it can be difficult as you look at the legislation across all those rules. And the fact is that putting it onto the producers is going to make that even worse because you're trying to build products, right, as a producer. You're not trying to do all this regulatory compliance, but unfortunately, it's the way of the future. And then consumer behavior is changing, right? We talked about that. Negative ESG scores. The reality is that when you look at institutional investors that are out there for the publicly traded companies, they are affecting corporate valuations. Even if it's not specifically attributable, if you look at places like BlackRock, things like that, it's estimated that they own up to 87% of the S&P 500. The fact is that they look very heavily at ESG scores, and if you're not getting that institutional money, it's hard to raise capital. PR and marketing value is increasing, frankly, by incorporating sustainability achievements into your messaging. There's several companies out there that have really gotten ahead of this and are really embracing that. The thing that I always tell my clients is the best way to combat a negative story is to tell a good one. So the fact is that if you can get ahead of this, embrace it, but also embrace it with your customers, you can go on that journey together and you'll be able to take credit for it. Talk a little bit about circularity. Why does it matter, right? The global population, a few more statistics for you guys. The global population is expected to grow to about 10 billion people in 2050. That can vary a little bit based on whichever study you're talking about, but the fact is we know there's a lot more people on planet Earth right now. Since 2015, the global economy has consumed 70% more new materials than it can safely replenish. Basically, we're already using more raw materials than than the Earth can sustain. So the fact is, we're already there and it's growing. The number's not going down, it's going up. So how do we halt that? Circular economy moves away from the traditional, the take, the make, and the waste models. The reality is that it's keeping products and materials in use, bringing it right back into your own supply chains. And I know most of you already know about this, but the circular approach will frankly help with supply chain resilience, right? By making recycled materials more accessible to producers. So if it's done the right way, you can actually bring your material back into your own supply. One of the companies that we work with is a major beverage manufacturer, and you probably know them, they're based out of Atlanta. The fact is, when we did the program for them on their sustainability, they brought back 20% of all the bottles and cans that they sell. To give you an idea in terms of dollars and why it matters, that ROI reduced their spend from $2.2 billion by $440 million a year. The fact is they bought $50 million of recycling equipment to capture it internally. There were other items to that, but the reality is that a fourth grader can do that math. The ROI was 6 weeks. So it can be done. And then increasing the recycled content in your packaging allows you to make that happen, right? So, and I'll highlight some of these other ones going forward. But let's talk a little bit about extended producer responsibility. We're going to take it very simple, but it's who pays, who keeps score, and who executes. That's how a layman looks at it, right? And essentially, if you look at this, EPR legislation shifts that away from municipalities and the consumers, right? Meaning the taxpayer, to the producers of the packaging waste, right? To the actual brands themselves. So, and then who keeps score, right? Producer responsibility organizations. The Circular Action Alliance, great example of that. They were actually selected by the first 3 states that have gone into place already. And in terms of being able to get resources to be able to make sure that your brand is compliant, also being able to track the data, having a standard clearinghouse where those fees go into, that's really important. They designed that plan then to achieve the required recycling rate. And then finally, who executes? It's going to come down to the haulers that are selected. Once a plan's been decided upon in a given location, then it's going to come back out and they're going to have to build the infrastructure behind it. I'm going to talk about it here in a minute, but the US is going to need one heck of a update in the MRF technology, right? Material recovery facilities. Because the fact is, a lot of these areas where they're passing these laws, once you get outside of the cities, the infrastructure is just not there. In Europe, it's a fairly simple process to be able to execute them on. But the problem is that when you go to, let's say, California, once you get outside of Fresno and you've got cities outside of there or even towns outside of there, you're going to have to haul it 200, 300, 400 miles. If you drive 200, 300, 400 miles in Europe, you've probably crossed 2 international borders. So you don't have the population density like you do in other areas. So it's going to be a heavy lift in the United States in terms of infrastructure improvement. So basically, once that execution is done by the haulers, they're going to implement that approved plan, right? The MRFs then sort out the material, they send it to end markets. Standard recycling technology, okay? Here's the current landscape. I think the biggest thing that I would leave you guys with is that EPR laws aren't anything new, right? You guys have been paying for the core charges on your batteries for years and years and years, right? In Iowa, where I live, we've had a bottle bill in place since 1978. The fact is we get 93% of aluminum and plastic outside of there, and it's been going on for over 40 years. The difference in Iowa versus other areas, let's say the CRV in California, is that the CRV, the state is the owner of the can. In Iowa and Oregon, for example, the distributor is the owner of the can. So what it's actually brought into is a much higher recycled percentage because of the fact that there's accountability on both sides. The widely varying EPR packaging legislation being passed at the state level is frankly something that is concerning because you don't have a standard, and we talked about that before. There's no federal mandates to simplify compliance. That's difficult, right? And utilizing these producer responsibility organizations to be able to collectively work together as producers to be able to implement best practices, do all of those things, operational excellence, all of those items are going to be areas to do that. Fees and reporting requirements, those penalties vary by state. There is no standard roadmap. It's difficult. Okay? If we look at the current legislation passed or in progress, the blue items that you're going to see right over here, those are states that are passed. Most of you guys already know this. Those are the states that are already in place. And you can also see on the orange and the green, those are states that are currently in process right now legislatively. Okay, not just ones that they're talking about, but these are actually in process and moving through. And quite likely to pass, to be honest with you. And then EPR, what does it seek to accomplish? Really the big thing is to be able to make recycling services available to everyone. That's really what the lawmakers are trying to do. The contracts with the PROs is really to be able to help the companies navigate this, right? It tends to be a consortium of producers. You'll have different regulatory bodies being involved in that. And then you'll also have the haulers that actually have to pull it off. And then really funding and infrastructure needs in order to be able to comply with those mandates. As I mentioned earlier, the infrastructure requirements that is probably the biggest challenge in the US, just because we're spread out. And then the hauler programs to provide the recycling services to everybody. If you look at Tennessee, for example, I was working with a city about an hour outside of Nashville, and they're recycling, they do the cardboard, they do aluminum, kind of all the usual suspects, and they only do 1 and 2 plastic. Well, what I showed you guys a couple slides ago is that Tennessee is pushing an EPR process through. They're going to have to add all that infrastructure in each one of their locations because now they're going to have to take 3 through 7s. They do it in some places, but I can promise you outside of Nashville, it doesn't exist because the population's too spread out. That is not going to be cheap. And then the MRF expansions and retrofits to handle not only the increased volume, but the increased footprint that is being required of this. I think one of the real big opportunities, though, is going to be AI-driven solutions, right? One of the things that we're seeing with other locations is they're putting the SKUs on there, and then they're also doing the QR codes in terms of being able to execute. That's a real opportunity for some of these AI-driven systems. There's several integrators of MRF technology that are able to identify that. I think that's going to be a real wave for the future for us. The good news is that those systems can actually be retrofitted back into existing recycling operations. You're seeing the Waste Managements, the Republics, various companies around the United States, and they're adding a lot of AI into their process. That will help. And then really it's expanding those single stream programs to be able to handle the EPA mandated commodities. Like I mentioned earlier, the 3 through the 7s. What we have to figure out, and the jury's still out on it to a certain extent, is how far it's going to go. One of the big things that I see in terms of the plastics is with the different layered technologies and all the different formulations that mix products together, that becomes difficult, A, because you have to deconstruct all of all those different layers, but it's also making it recyclable, developing end markets. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the EPR legislation and producer fees are designed to pay for these improvements, but there's a but there. So what are the challenges? We're going to have to increase the single stream recycling programs with a lot more grades collected. That area of complexity takes a lot of space, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money. And then the states with the less population density, they're going to have to either create or be able to expand on the existing infrastructure. And then the transport across longer distances, that's money, right? I think one of the things that the EPR has not addressed, and I think this is important to note, they haven't addressed the carbon footprint of all of that transportation. That's adding to it. So I think some of the stuff with packaging is an easy get, but it's also not taking care of everything. You really have to look at how are your emissions going to be when you transport something 400 miles? How are you going to implement this in northern Alaska and bring it to Seattle for processing? I mean, that's a heavy lift. And then what we also need is more end markets for that recycling material. So for example, there's 6 to 7 mills in the United States currently accepting aseptic packaging for recycling. I can tell you that I've been at this too long, that's why my hair's white. But the fact is that for the longest time, aseptic packaging was not recyclable. Nobody knew how to deconstruct it. And the fact is that there's been a huge, innovation in that side. So industry-led organizations, they can help fill the gaps. Carton Council, that Carton Council is a great association and consortium of different packaging companies that are specifically handling cartons. They've done a tremendous job. They do grants actually for customers, and we've done several projects where they will provide grants to incorporate recycling operations like optical sorters, robots, bunkers, and various other options like this. The shift, we're talking about going from waste to value, right? The circular economy models in action, those are all options. Closed loop recycling, bring it back into your operations, and then compostable materials. You guys are seeing a lot of that in compost. And then the reusable packaging systems. One of the things that we're actually handing out at our booth this week is the aluminum cups, right? Ball Container did a tremendous job with that. They've really been pushing for the aluminum cups. If you guys go to a lot of the different sports venues now, that's what you get, right? There's no question whether aluminum is recyclable. It's an opportunity. So strategies for success, how do we pull it off? We're talking about auditing packaging waste and its recyclability. Get in on the front end of this. It's the best advice I can give you guys. Engage your suppliers. Every supplier that is here is talking about sustainability. If you have a supplier or anybody here who's exhibiting isn't talking about sustainability, run. That's the best advice I can give you. And then collaborate across your supply chain. Incorporate that. Don't just stop in one place. Carry it through, because all of them are going to have good ideas. So the ability for you to make that holistic, incorporate it into your ERP systems, and then be able to score that. That's a real opportunity for you guys. And then that comes into tracking the KPIs, your material efficiencies, right? If you're not getting the efficiency out of some of that, that was always the argument for years, is that using the recycled content wasn't going to be efficient enough, or the regulators didn't like it. And then you look at recycling and recovery rates, and frankly, cost savings. And then really it's designed for compliance and the consumer. So not only design your packaging, but also tell your story. If you're telling the story, that's good. That's free marketing, right? Take advantage of it. People are looking for it. Let's talk about some real world examples of leadership. Tetra Pak, Coca-Cola, graphic packaging. These are a few of the companies that we've worked with over the years to frankly help increase their opportunities and take advantage of their sustainability. I just pulled a few of these items from their website right here. You can see some of the different items right here. $42 million invested, right, to support collection, sorting, and recycling of their packages internationally. That's a significant investment. That's real money. If you look at some of the other options, and I can share some of this with you. Jason Pelch is actually here in the audience. He's with Tetra Pak and on their sustainability team. But if you look at one of these things, you know, going across from food systems circularity all the way to social sustainability, they're not only putting that information out there, but they're living by it. And I think that's important for all of us to remember. Talk a little bit about Coca-Cola. These are a little bit bigger, so it'll be easier to read. But if you look at it, 99% of their packages are recyclable, okay? They're using 28% recycled content. And that's typically on their PET side. They'll specifically talk about our PET. Part of what's driving that in the United States is that they're regulated by the FDA. So our PET was kind of a challenge for a long time for those of you that have been around the bottling industry. It was difficult. It is changing. Some other regulatory environments, Europe, you can use a lot more, but I see that number going up because, frankly, it's going to be required. And then if you look at this, 2024, 65% of their equivalent bottles and cans were introduced into the market. They were collected and refilled, or they were recycled. Those are demonstrable results. Are they where they want them to be yet? No. They'll actually tell you on their sustainability report that they're not where they want to be yet. And then let's talk about graphic packaging, right? You can see some of the things that I saw in there. They talk about this, innovation, right? I mentioned that earlier. They actually filed 130 patents in 2024, specific to their sustainability packaging, right? And then they're receiving awards for this, right? But they're implementing their excellence systems across the board. And I think one of the biggest items that you see in here is that they're also doing the sustainable forestry, right? They're getting ahead of it so that we're not at 70% more consumption than what they can reasonably handle. So you got to get ahead of that, okay? So really, where's the ROI for these guys, right? We talked about value in here. The products featuring the sustainability attributes, it will achieve 6 to 25% revenue increase. And I'm happy to share any of these sources with you guys afterwards, but that's a significant number. And then really it's to develop those initiatives to capture those materials, become your own end market. I said that earlier. The ability to be able to come right back into your own supply chain, what you're talking about doing at that point is reducing your own COGS. If you're able to get down your cost of goods sold by utilizing your own material, why would you want it to go to anybody else? We've actually seen this to where they will go to other industry organizations and your competition will try to buy your packaging recycled material. We've actually had it happen with bottlers to where the competitor was buying it, lowering their cost of goods sold, and then the other person was having to buy virgin material. The fact is knowing where your supply chain goes at the end is just as important as knowing where it goes on the front end. And then lower your costs, right? It's simple. Put as much recycled content as you can in there. Not only because of the marketing benefits, there are some items where it can cost more, but it's also giving you that story and it's being able to provide demonstrable results to your customers because the data shows that people want this. And then it's reimagining your packaging design for compliance and consumer expectations, right? The data's out. We're all talking about this here. So the fact is look at it from top to bottom and never stop innovating. I think that's probably the biggest item I'd leave you guys with is that don't just talk about advancing or saving money, but never stop innovating. It's not just grow or die, it's innovate or die.